The rain tapped softly against the windows of Riverside Community Center that Tuesday morning. Inside, the smell of fresh coffee mixed with the faint scent of old wood and cleaning supplies. It was the kind of place where locals came to learn watercolor painting, practice yoga, or join book clubs. Nothing fancy, just a warm space where the community gathered. Margaret stepped through the front doors, shaking droplets from her umbrella. She wore a simple floral dress, the kind you might find at any department store, and carried a canvas bag that had seen better days. Her graying hair was pulled back in a practical bun. She looked like someone's aunt, maybe a retired librarian or a longtime cafeteria worker, the kind of person you might pass on the street without a second glance. She had moved to this small town 3 weeks ago. Her mother was getting older, needing more help with daily tasks, and Margaret had put her own life on hold to be there. The days were long and quiet. Doctor appointments, grocery shopping, making sure her mother took her medications on time. It was necessary work, important work, but it left Margaret feeling invisible. That's why she had signed up for the adult beginner piano class. The flyer at the grocery store had caught her eye. No experience necessary, it said. All skill levels welcome. She thought it might be nice to meet some people, to have something that was just for her. A small escape twice a week. The community room was already filling up when she arrived. Folding chairs were arranged in neat rows facing an old upright piano that had probably been there since the building opened decades ago. The piano's wood was scratched, and one of the keys stuck a little when pressed, but it still held a tune. Around her, other students chatted excitedly. A woman in her 60s talked about how she'd always wanted to learn as a child, but her family couldn't afford lessons. A middle-aged man mentioned that his daughter played beautifully, and he wanted to understand her world better. Margaret chose a seat in the back row. She liked being able to observe without being noticed. She set her canvas bag on the floor and folded her hands in her lap, waiting quietly. The teacher arrived exactly at 9 o'clock. His name was Robert, and he couldn't have been more than 26 or 27 years old. He carried himself with the confidence of someone who had recently accomplished something significant. His leather messenger bag looked expensive, and he wore a blazer over a button-down shirt, perhaps a bit too formal for a community center class. Robert introduced himself with enthusiasm. He had just graduated from the conservatory upstate, he told them. He had studied under renowned professors whose names he rattled off, expecting recognition that mostly didn't come. He had performed in recitals throughout his university years. Now he was back in his hometown, ready to share his knowledge with the community. Music is a language, Robert announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. And like any language, it requires proper instruction from the very beginning. Too many people try to teach themselves and develop bad habits that are extremely difficult to break later. He said this with such certainty that a few students shifted uncomfortably in their seats, suddenly worried they might have tried plunking out a few tunes on their own keyboards at home. Margaret listened without expression. She had heard speeches like this before many times, in many different concert halls and practice rooms across the world. The confidence of youth combined with fresh education was a familiar melody. Robert spent the first hour explaining the absolute basics. He showed them how to sit properly at the piano, the right distance from the keys, the correct height for the bench. He demonstrated proper hand position, curving the fingers just so, keeping the wrists level. He talked about posture, about breathing, about the importance of understanding music theory before ever attempting to play a real piece. The other students took notes diligently. Margaret simply watched, her hands still folded in her lap. When Robert asked if anyone had questions, she remained silent while others raised their hands to ask about reading sheet music or finding middle C. "Don't worry if this seems overwhelming," Robert assured the class with a smile that was probably meant to be encouraging, but came across slightly condescending. "Everyone starts somewhere. By the end of this 8-week course, you'll be able to play simple songs. Nothing too complicated, of course, but you'll have the foundation to continue learning if you choose." He demonstrated a C major scale, his fingers moving smoothly across the white keys, up and down, up and down. He made it look easy, which it was for him. "This is where we all begin," he said, "the building blocks of everything that comes after." For the second hour, Robert had each student come to the piano one by one to try the scale themselves. It was awkward for most of them. Fingers stumbled, hit wrong notes, forgot the pattern halfway through. Robert corrected them patiently but firmly, adjusting hand positions, reminding them about keeping their wrists steady. When it was Margaret's turn, she walked to the piano with quiet steps. She sat on the bench and adjusted it slightly, a movement so subtle and practiced that no one really noticed. She placed her hands on the keys and played the C major scale, up and down. Clean and accurate. No fumbling, no wrong notes. But also nothing flashy, nothing that would draw attention. Very good, Robert said, sounding mildly surprised. Have you played before? A little, Margaret replied softly. A long time ago. Well, you've retained the basics nicely, Robert said. Though we'll need to work on your dynamics and expression as we progress. Technique is important, but music is about emotion too. Margaret simply nodded and returned to her seat in the back row. A small smile might have flickered across her face, so brief that anyone watching would have thought they imagined it. As the class ended, students gathered their belongings and chatted about practice schedules. The woman in her 60s was excited about the keyboard her children had bought her for her birthday. The man with the musical daughter was already worried he wouldn't be able to keep up. Robert packed his messenger bag, clearly satisfied with how the first class had gone. He had laid a solid foundation, he thought. These people were lucky to have someone with his training guiding them. So many community classes were taught by amateurs who barely knew more than their students. Margaret slipped out quietly, umbrella in hand. The rain had lightened to a drizzle. She walked to her car, just another ordinary woman in a floral dress heading home to make lunch for her elderly mother. Nothing special, nothing remarkable. If Robert had paid closer attention, he might have noticed the way she had adjusted that piano bench with the unconscious precision of someone who had sat at thousands of piano benches. He might have seen how her fingers had touched the keys with a familiarity that went beyond a little childhood piano lessons. He might have wondered why someone who played a perfect scale without hesitation would join a beginner's class. But he didn't notice. He saw what he expected to see, a simple, quiet woman who needed his expert instruction, and Margaret preferred it that way. For now, at least. She drove home through the small-town streets, past the hardware store and the diner and the post office, back to the life she had chosen, carrying secrets that nobody asked about. 3 weeks passed in a comfortable rhythm. Margaret attended every Tuesday and Thursday class, always arriving 5 minutes early, always sitting in the same back row seat. She completed each exercise Robert assigned without fuss or fanfare. When he taught them Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star with one hand, she played it correctly the first time. When he introduced both hands working together, she managed it while others struggled. Robert noticed her consistency but mistook it for something else. He thought she was simply a diligent student, perhaps someone who practiced more than the others at home. A good example for the class, certainly, but nothing extraordinary. In his mind, she was exactly what she appeared to be. A humble woman with some natural aptitude who followed instructions well. The other students liked Margaret. During breaks, she would listen to them talk about their grandchildren, their jobs, their struggles with arthritis making certain finger positions difficult. She never talked much about herself. When asked, she would simply say she was caring for her mother and enjoying having something creative to do. People found her easy to be around precisely because she never drew attention to herself. Then came the Friday afternoon when everything changed. Robert was in the community center office, reviewing his lesson plans for the following week, when Patricia, the center's director, burst through the door. Her face was flushed and she was slightly out of breath. "Robert, we have a serious problem," she said, sinking into the chair across from his desk. He looked up from his papers, concerned. Patricia was usually the calm, organized type. Seeing her flustered was unusual. "It's the fundraiser," she continued, pressing her fingers to her temples. "Tomorrow night. Daniel was supposed to play piano during the silent auction, but his wife just called. He's in the hospital with pneumonia. He's going to be fine, but there's no way he can perform." Robert's stomach dropped. The annual fundraiser was the community center's biggest event of the year. Local businesses donated items for the auction, and the money raised kept the center's programs running. Music during the event wasn't just background noise. It created atmosphere, made people feel good, encouraged them to open their wallets. "Can we find someone else?" Robert asked, though even as he said it, he knew it was a long shot. This was a small town. Most accomplished musicians had already moved to bigger cities for better opportunities. Patricia shook her head. I've called everyone I can think of. The church organist is out of town visiting her daughter. The high school music teacher has a wedding to attend. I even called the piano store over in Millbrook, but their instructor is booked solid with recitals all weekend. They sat in silence for a moment, both thinking through impossible options. What about you? Patricia asked hopefully. Could you play? Robert winced. I'm already running the check-in table and coordinating the volunteers. I can't do both. Plus, someone needs to be available to troubleshoot problems. Last year, the sound system failed twice, Patricia groaned. You're right. We need you mobile, not stuck at a piano all evening. They brainstormed for another 20 minutes, coming up with and then dismissing idea after idea. A recorded playlist would work as a last resort, but it would lack the personal touch that made the event special. People commented every year on the live music, how it made the center feel more like a home than an institution. Finally, Robert remembered something. What about one of my students? He suggested tentatively. Patricia raised her eyebrows. Your beginner class? Robert, no offense, but they've only been playing for 3 weeks. I know, he said quickly. But we don't need anything complicated. Just some simple, pleasant music in the background. Maybe chopsticks or heart and soul. Something light and cheerful that doesn't require much skill. It would still be live music, still better than a recording. Patricia considered this, desperation winning out over doubt. Do you have anyone in mind? Someone who wouldn't be too nervous in front of people? Robert thought through his roster of students. Most of them would probably panic at the suggestion. The woman who was learning for her 60th birthday would be too anxious. The man with the musical daughter would insist he wasn't ready. The younger students might be willing, but they made too many mistakes. Then he thought of Margaret. Quiet, steady, reliable Margaret who never made errors. She wouldn't dazzle anyone, but she wouldn't embarrass herself either. She seemed like the type who wouldn't get flustered by a crowd. There's one student who might work, Robert said slowly. Her name is Margaret. She's very consistent, never makes mistakes on the simple pieces, and she's mature enough to handle the pressure. I could ask her to just play some basic songs, nothing fancy. Set her up in the corner where she won't feel like she's performing, more like she's just practicing while people happen to be there. Patricia grabbed onto this lifeline. Could you call her today? I hate to put someone on the spot like this, but we're desperate. Robert checked the time. It was almost 4 o'clock. He found Margaret's information in his student files and dialed her number, hoping she would answer. She picked up on the 3rd ring.
Hello?
Hi, Margaret. This is Robert, your piano teacher from the community center. Oh, hello, she said, and he could hear surprise in her voice. Teachers didn't usually call students at home. He explained the situation, probably talking faster than he should have. The sick pianist, the important fundraiser, the need for someone to play simple background music. Nothing complicated, he assured her several times. Just easy songs that she already knew, maybe an hour or 2 of playing with breaks. She could even repeat the same few songs over and over. Nobody would really be paying that much attention anyway. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Robert waited, trying not to sound too desperate, though he was very close to begging. What time should I arrive? Margaret finally asked, her voice quiet and measured. Relief flooded through him. Really? You'll do it? That's wonderful, Margaret. Thank you so much. The event starts at 6, but if you could come at 5:30, that would be perfect, just to get comfortable with the piano there. All right, she said simply. I'll be there. And Margaret, don't worry about it being perfect. Honestly, just play whatever you're comfortable with. Mary Had a Little Lamb, Ode to Joy, anything like that. The simpler the better. You're really saving us here. I understand, Margaret replied. I'll see you tomorrow evening. After she hung up, Margaret stood in her mother's kitchen, still holding the phone. Her mother was napping in the next room, the television playing softly. Through the window, she could see the neighbor's cat prowling through the garden. Something flickered across her face, not quite a smile, not quite sadness. Something more complicated, like a memory that hurt and healed at the same time. She walked to the small spare room where she had been staying. In the closet behind her modest collection of dresses and cardigans was a locked case she hadn't opened in months. She pulled it out and set it on the bed. Her fingers traced the worn leather, hesitating over the latches. Then she opened it. Inside, carefully preserved, were pieces of sheet music. Not beginner songs, not simple melodies. The pages were worn soft from years of use, marked with pencil notes and reminders written in her own hand from another lifetime. Margaret selected a few pieces and set them on the dresser. Then she closed the case and returned it to the closet, back behind the ordinary clothes of her ordinary life. She had agreed to play simple songs, background music that nobody would pay attention to. Robert had been very clear about that. He wanted nothing fancy, nothing that would draw focus from the fundraiser's real purpose. But Margaret stood there in that quiet room, looking at the sheet music on the dresser, and for the first time in 3 weeks something stirred in her chest, something that had been sleeping, hidden away, carefully protected from the world. Tomorrow night she would go to the community center. She would sit at that old upright piano with its sticky key and scratched wood, and then, well, she would make a decision when the moment came. Robert thought he had solved his problem with a simple phone call. He had no idea what he had actually set in motion. Saturday evening arrived with clear skies and a gentle breeze that carried the scent of autumn leaves. The community center had been transformed. White tablecloths covered the folding tables, and small vases with fresh flowers sat at each station displaying auction items. Strings of warm lights hung from the ceiling, casting a soft glow over everything. It looked magical in the way that simple spaces can when people care enough to make them special. Margaret arrived at 5:30 as promised. She wore the same floral dress from her first class, though she had added a cardigan against the evening chill. In her hands she carried her worn canvas bag and a folder of sheet music. Robert spotted her immediately and rushed over, still holding his clipboard of volunteer assignments. "Margaret, thank you again for doing this. You're a lifesaver, honestly." He gestured toward the corner where the old upright piano sat. "We've set you up over there. Nice and out of the way so you won't feel too much pressure. People will start arriving around 6. He walked her to the piano, talking the whole way about how grateful everyone was, how she should just play whatever she felt comfortable with, how nobody expected perfection. Margaret nodded along, setting her bag down beside the piano bench. "Seriously, just keep it simple," Robert said one more time. "Play through your basic songs, take breaks whenever you need to. There's water bottles on the table behind you. If you need anything, just wave me down. I'll be fine," Margaret said quietly, settling onto the bench. Robert gave her an encouraging smile and then hurried off to check on the registration table. He had 100 other details to manage, and honestly, knowing the piano situation was handled gave him one less thing to worry about. Margaret seemed calm and capable. She would play her simple songs, provide some pleasant background music, and that would be that. Margaret sat alone at the piano for a few minutes. She adjusted the bench with careful precision, the same movement she had made in class but with more intention this time. She opened her folder and looked at the pieces she had brought. Her fingers rested on the keys, not pressing down, just feeling the familiar smooth surface. Around her, volunteers made final preparations. Patricia walked through checking table arrangements. The caterer brought in trays of appetizers. Someone tested the microphone at the front podium. The normal chaos of an event coming together. At 6 o'clock, guests began to arrive. Local business owners in their Saturday best. Families who used the center's programs. Elderly couples who had lived in town for decades. They collected their bidding numbers, picked up glasses of wine or punch, and began circulating through the auction displays. Robert had been right about one thing. The piano was positioned in a corner, somewhat separated from the main flow of activity. People could hear music from there without it being the focus of attention. It was meant to be background, atmosphere, nothing more. Margaret watched the room fill. She saw Robert at the entrance greeting people with confident handshakes. She saw Patricia laughing with a group of donors. She saw children carefully touching auction items while their parents read the bid sheets. Then she placed her hands on the keys and began to play. Their opening notes of Debussy's Clair de Lune floated across the room, soft as moonlight. For a few moments, nothing changed. People continued their conversations, examining auction items, sipping their drinks. The music was there, pleasant and unobtrusive, exactly what background music should be. But then something began to happen. The quality of sound coming from that old upright piano was different from what anyone expected. Each note was clear and perfectly weighted. The melody didn't just play, it breathed. It rose and fell with emotion that seemed impossible from such a humble instrument in such an ordinary setting. A woman near the quilted wall hanging paused mid-sentence. She turned her head slightly, listening. A man studying a donated restaurant gift certificate set it down and looked toward the corner. The music continued, building and flowing like water over stones. Margaret's hands moved across the keyboard with grace that seemed effortless. But anyone who knew anything about piano would recognize the decades of discipline behind such ease. Her fingers danced through the complex passages as if they were simple scales. Her whole body swayed slightly with the music's emotion, lost in the piece. More conversations trailed off. More heads turned. Robert was helping an elderly couple with their bidding number when he first noticed the change in the room's energy. Something was different. People were standing still, listening instead of browsing. He glanced toward the piano corner, expecting to see Margaret plunking through Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. What he saw instead made him freeze completely. The woman at the piano bore little resemblance to the quiet student from his beginner class. This person commanded the instrument with absolute authority. Her hands swept across the keys in movements that were both powerful and delicate. She wasn't reading sheet music. Her eyes were closed, the piece flowing from memory and feeling. And the sound. Dear God, the sound was extraordinary. Robert's mouth went dry. His mind struggled to process what he was seeing and hearing. This wasn't possible. This was a beginner student. She had only been playing for 3 weeks. She shouldn't be able to play like this. Nobody should be able to play like this on a cheap upright piano in a community center. But she was. As Clair de Lune reached its final, gentle notes, the room had gone completely silent. Every conversation had stopped. Every person had turned toward the piano. The piece ended with a whisper of sound that seemed to hang in the air like morning mist. For a heartbeat, there was absolute stillness. Then someone started clapping. Others joined immediately. Within seconds, the entire room erupted in applause. Not polite charity applause, but genuine appreciation bordering on awe. Margaret opened her eyes, seeming to come back from somewhere far away. She looked surprised by the response, as if she had forgotten there were other people in the room. A slight blush colored her cheeks, but she didn't stop. After a moment, she placed her hands back on the keys and began Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major. If Clair de Lune had been moonlight, this was starlight. Delicate and shimmering, achingly beautiful. The melody sang out with a clarity that made several people's eyes well up with tears they couldn't explain. It was the kind of music that reached into your chest and found memories you didn't know you had. First loves and last goodbyes. Quiet moments and profound losses. Everything human and vulnerable wrapped up in sound. People began moving closer to the piano, drawn like moths to flame. They formed a loose semicircle, standing respectfully back but unable to maintain the pretense of browsing auction items. The fundraiser had become a concert and nobody seemed to mind. Patricia stood with her hand over her heart, tears streaming down her face. She had lived in this town for 40 years, had directed the community center for 15, and had never experienced anything like this within these walls. Robert couldn't move from his spot near the entrance. His clipboard hung forgotten at his side. His mind replayed every interaction with Margaret. Every class where she had sat quietly in the back. Every simple scale he had condescendingly taught her. Every time he had praised her basic competence as if she should be grateful for his approval. The weight of his assumptions crashed over him like a wave. This wasn't a student who had retained some childhood lessons. This wasn't natural aptitude or diligent practice. This was mastery. Real, profound, professional mastery. Who was she? How had he been so blind? The Chopin piece built to its emotional climax, Margaret's hands flying across the keys in passages that would make experienced pianists nervous. But she played with confidence that came from somewhere deep and unshakable. This was muscle memory built over decades. This was artistry earned through thousands of hours of practice and performance. As the final notes faded, the applause was even louder than before. People called out "Bravo" and "Encore," as if they were in a concert hall instead of a community center in a small town. Margaret sat quietly at the piano, her hands folded in her lap, that same modest demeanor from class settling back over her like a familiar coat. She looked like she might stand up and slip away, disappearing back into the ordinary woman in the floral dress. But an elderly woman from the crowd pushed through, her face urgent and excited. She moved with the determination of someone who had just recognized something impossible. She reached the piano and stared at Margaret with wide eyes. "Margaret Chen?" she said, her voice shaking. "Is it really you?" The elderly woman stood before Margaret with trembling hands pressed to her chest. Her eyes were bright with tears and recognition. The crowd around the piano had gone quiet again, sensing something important was unfolding. "Margaret Chen," the woman repeated, more certain this time. "I saw you perform at Carnegie Hall. It must have been 1998, or maybe 99. You played Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 3. I was visiting my daughter in New York and she got us tickets. I'll never forget it. Never. You were absolutely magnificent." A ripple of whispers spread through the crowd. Carnegie Hall, Rachmaninoff. These weren't words typically associated with community center piano students. Margaret looked at the elderly woman with a mixture of surprise and something that might have been pain. She opened her mouth as if to speak, then closed it again. Finally, she managed a small nod. "That was a long time ago," Margaret said softly. But the woman wasn't finished. She turned to address the crowd, her voice gaining strength. "Do you all understand who this is?" Margaret Chen was one of the most celebrated concert pianists of her generation. She performed with symphony orchestras around the world: Boston, London, Tokyo, Vienna. I read about her in magazines. She was a child prodigy who kept getting better and better, and then she just... The woman paused, looking back at Margaret with confusion and concern. "You disappeared. All the articles said you had retired, but you were so young. There were rumors about an injury, but nobody knew for sure. What happened?" The crowd pressed closer, curiosity and amazement written on every face. Margaret sat very still on the piano bench, her hands now folded tightly in her lap. She looked smaller somehow, as if she wanted to disappear into herself. Robert finally managed to move his feet. He pushed through the crowd, his face burning with shame and disbelief. When he reached the piano, he couldn't meet Margaret's eyes. "I had no idea," he stammered. "Margaret, I'm so sorry. The way I spoke to you in class, the way I treated you like you didn't know anything. God, I told you that you needed to work on your dynamics and expression. I can't believe I—" Margaret held up a hand gently, stopping him. "You didn't know," she said simply. "How could you?" Patricia appeared at Robert's elbow, still wiping tears from her face. "Margaret, I think everyone here would love to understand. If you're willing to share, that is. You certainly don't owe us an explanation." Margaret looked out at all the faces watching her. These were her neighbors now. People she saw at the grocery store and the post office. People who had welcomed her to their small town without knowing anything about her past. There was kindness in their eyes, not judgment. Curiosity, yes, but also genuine care. She took a deep breath. "The woman is right," Margaret began, her voice quiet but steady. "I was a concert pianist. I started playing when I was 4 years old. My parents noticed I could play back any melody I heard, so they found me a teacher. By the time I was 7, I was performing in competitions. At 12, I played with my first orchestra. At 16, I was touring internationally." She paused, her fingers unconsciously moving as if playing invisible keys. "It was everything I knew. Practice rooms and concert halls and hotel rooms in cities I barely saw. I loved the music, truly loved it. But it was also exhausting in ways that are hard to explain. The pressure to always be perfect. The reviews that could be cruel. The constant travel. The loneliness of it all." A young mother in the crowd shifted her toddler to her other hip, completely absorbed in the story. "Then, about 15 years ago, I developed a problem with my right wrist. It started small, just a little pain after long practice sessions, but I ignored it because I had performances scheduled, contracts to honor, people depending on me. The pain got worse. I started making mistakes I had never made before. Missing notes, losing control in fast passages." Margaret held up her right hand, turning it slowly as if examining it from a distance. "Finally, a doctor told me I had damaged the tendons severely, something that had probably been building for years. All those hours of practice since childhood, all that repetition. He said I needed surgery and at least a year of rest. Maybe longer. Maybe I would never play professionally again. The room was so quiet you could hear the hum of the refrigerator in the center's kitchen. I was 32 years old, and suddenly I didn't know who I was without the piano. My whole life had been built around performing. I had no other skills, no other identity. The thought of going back after surgery, of trying to recapture what I had lost, was terrifying. What if I couldn't? What if I was just a shadow of what I had been?" Margaret's voice grew even softer and people leaned in to hear. "So I stepped away. I told my agent I was retiring. I canceled all my contracts. I moved back home to be near my family. For years, I barely touched a piano. Every time I tried, my wrist would ache and the fear would come back. Fear that I had lost it all, that I would never play the way I once did. An older man in the back of the crowd wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. Then my mother started needing more care, and I moved here to help her. One day I saw a flyer for a beginner piano class at the community center. Something about it appealed to me. The idea of starting over, of being a beginner again, with no expectations, no pressure, just playing for the simple joy of it. She looked up at Robert, and there was no anger in her expression, only understanding. You treated me exactly how I wanted to be treated, like someone learning from scratch, like someone who didn't have decades of history weighing on every note. It was freeing in a way I can't quite describe, getting to rediscover the basics, remembering why I fell in love with music in the first place before it became my job, before it became complicated. Robert shook his head, still struggling with the enormity of his mistake. But I was so condescending, so arrogant. I thought I was teaching you. A small smile crossed Margaret's face, the first genuine smile most people in the room had seen from her. You were teaching me, she said. Just not what you thought. You reminded me that music isn't about perfection. It's not about impressing people or meeting impossible standards. Sometimes it's just about sitting at a piano and playing Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star and finding beauty in simplicity. Patricia spoke up, her voice thick with emotion. Would you consider giving a proper concert here? A benefit concert for the center? I think the whole town would come. We could raise so much money for the programs. Margaret hesitated, old fears flickering across her face. I don't know. I haven't performed a full concert in 15 years. My wrist still bothers me sometimes. And the pressure, the expectations once people know who I am. Then don't make it about that, a voice called from the crowd. It was the man who was taking lessons to understand his daughter's world better. Make it about sharing something you love with people who already appreciate you for who you are now, not who you used to be. Others murmured agreement. We're not critics from New York, someone said. We're just folks who would love to hear you play. Margaret looked around at all these faces. In the 3 weeks she had lived here, these people had shown her nothing but simple kindness. The cashier at the grocery store who always asked about her mother. The pharmacist who made sure her mother's prescriptions were ready on time. The neighbor who brought over soup when she knew Margaret had been up all night with her mother's illness. This wasn't Carnegie Hall with its polished critics and impossible standards. This was a community center with scratched floors and folding chairs. These were real people who had real lives and real struggles. They weren't asking for perfection. They were asking for connection. All right, Margaret said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. I'll do it. The room erupted in applause again, but this time it was different. It wasn't the awed applause of impressed audience members. It was the warm appreciation of a community welcoming one of their own. Robert stood off to the side, watching Margaret surrounded by well-wishers. He felt the full weight of the lesson he had just learned. Humility wasn't something you could teach in a classroom. It was something you had to learn by being completely, thoroughly humbled. He had thought he was the teacher, bringing knowledge to those who lacked it. But Margaret had been teaching him all along. Teaching him that expertise doesn't announce itself, that mastery often walks quietly among us, that the people we underestimate might be the very ones we need to learn from most. And perhaps most importantly, that a true master never stops being a student. The weeks following the fundraiser passed in a blur of activity. Word spread through the small town like wildfire. Margaret Chen, the quiet woman in the floral dress who helped her elderly mother with groceries, was actually a world-renowned pianist. The story had everything people loved: hidden talent, humble circumstances, and the promise of something extraordinary happening right in their own backyard. Patricia worked with Margaret to plan the benefit concert. Scheduled for a Friday evening 4 weeks away, they decided to hold it in the community center rather than trying to find a fancier venue. Margaret insisted on it. This is where I found my way back to music, she said. It feels right to perform here. The tickets were priced modestly, $20 for adults, $10 for students and seniors. Within 3 days, every single one was sold. Patricia had to add folding chairs to accommodate everyone. People were coming from neighboring towns, some driving over an hour just for the chance to hear Margaret play. Robert continued teaching his beginner piano class, but everything had changed. He arrived early now, not to prepare demonstrations of his own skill, but to listen if any students wanted to share their struggles. He asked more questions. He assumed less. When Margaret attended class, which she did every Tuesday and Thursday without fail, he treated her with genuine respect, but not the fawning deference he might have shown before. She had made it clear she was there as a student, and he honored that. One Thursday evening, 2 weeks before the concert, Robert stayed after class to help Margaret test the piano that would be used for the performance. Patricia had arranged to borrow a better instrument from a church in the next town. It was a baby grand, nothing compared to the concert pianos Margaret had played in her career, but significantly better than the old upright. As Margaret played a few scales to test the action of the keys, Robert gathered his courage to say something that had been weighing on him. "Margaret, I need to apologize again. Not just for treating you condescendingly, though that was bad enough, but for something bigger." She stopped playing and looked at him with patient curiosity. "I became a music teacher because I thought I had something important to give people," Robert continued, choosing his words carefully. "But I realize now I was really just trying to prove something to myself, that my expensive education meant something, that I was special because I had studied at a conservatory. I wasn't really seeing my students as people. I was seeing them as blank slates that I could fill with my knowledge." Margaret nodded slowly, understanding in her eyes. "The thing is," Robert went on, "you've taught me more in these few weeks than I learned in 4 years of university. Not about piano technique, but about why any of this matters. Music isn't about showing off what you know. It's about connection. It's about being human together." "That's a hard lesson to learn," Margaret said gently. "I had to learn it too. When I was younger, performing was about proving I was the best, winning competitions, getting standing ovations, impressing famous conductors. It took losing everything for me to understand that none of that was the point." "What is the point?" Robert asked. Margaret thought for a moment, her fingers resting lightly on the keys. "I think it's about being honest. When you play music honestly, when you let it express something real about being alive, other people feel that. They recognize their own joy or sadness or longing in the sound. It creates a moment where everyone in the room is experiencing the same emotion together. That's powerful. That matters. The technical skill is just the tool that makes that connection possible." Robert nodded, absorbing this. "Will you be nervous? For the concert?" "Terrified," Margaret admitted with a small laugh. "But maybe that's good. If I wasn't nervous, it would mean I didn't care. The fear means it matters to me." The night of the concert arrived cool and clear. Stars scattered across the October sky like spilled diamonds. People began arriving at the community center an hour before the performance, not wanting to miss a moment. They wore their nicest clothes, treating the evening with the reverence usually reserved for big city concert halls. Inside, the space had been transformed again. The folding chairs were arranged in neat rows facing a small stage area where the borrowed piano sat. Patricia had hung curtains to create a more intimate atmosphere. Candles in glass holders lined the windowsills, their light flickering gently. Margaret arrived 30 minutes early, wearing a simple black dress that was elegant without being showy. Her hair was styled more carefully than usual, but she wore minimal makeup. She looked like a refined version of herself, not a costume or a performance of who she used to be. Robert met her at the entrance. "The piano is ready. I tuned it myself this afternoon. Well, I had it professionally tuned, but I supervised very carefully." This earned him a genuine smile. "Thank you, Robert, for everything. Not just the piano. Are you ready?" he asked. "No," Margaret said honestly, "but I'm going to do it anyway." At 7 o'clock, Patricia stepped to the small podium that had been set up beside the piano. The crowd quieted immediately, anticipation thick in the air. "Thank you all for coming tonight," Patricia began. "A few weeks ago, we were scrambling to find someone to play background music at our fundraiser. We thought we were solving a small problem. What we actually discovered was an incredible gift that had been hiding in plain sight. Margaret Chen has become part of our community not because of her extraordinary talent, but because of her kindness, her humility, and her willingness to help a neighbor in need. Tonight she's sharing something precious with us, but I want to say one thing first." Patricia turned to look at Margaret, who sat quietly in the front row. "Margaret has asked me to make clear that she's not performing tonight as the famous concert pianist Margaret Chen. She's playing as our friend Margaret, who takes beginner piano classes on Tuesday and Thursday evenings, who helps her mother with doctor's appointments, who shops at the same grocery store we all do. She's one of us, and we're grateful she's chosen to share this part of herself with our community. The applause was warm and welcoming. Margaret stood and walked to the piano, her step steady despite the nerves fluttering in her chest. She sat on the bench, adjusted it with that practiced precision, and looked out at the faces watching her. She saw the woman from her piano class who was learning for her 60th birthday, sitting in the third row with her grown children. She saw the man who wanted to understand his daughter's world, holding hands with a teenage girl who must be that daughter. She saw the elderly woman who had recognized her at the fundraiser, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. She saw Robert standing against the back wall, his expression one of genuine respect and anticipation. These weren't faceless critics. They were people she knew, people who had shown her kindness without knowing her history, people who accepted her exactly as she was. Margaret placed her hands on the keys and began to play. She had chosen her program carefully. No showing off. No pieces selected just because they were difficult or impressive. Instead, she played music that meant something to her, a Schubert impromptu that reminded her of her grandmother, a Chopin waltz she had learned as a child, a modern piece by a composer who had died the year she retired, music she had always wanted to learn but never had the time for during her performing career. Between pieces, she spoke to the audience. Not formal concert chatter, but real conversation. She told them why she had chosen each piece. She shared memories associated with the music. She even laughed when describing a disastrous performance. In her 20s, when she had accidentally played the same section twice because she lost her place, the audience laughed with her, relaxed and engaged. This wasn't a formal concert where people sat rigid in their seats, afraid to cough. This was an evening among friends, sharing something beautiful together. 2 hours passed without anyone noticing the time. Margaret played pieces that made people cry and pieces that made them smile. Her wrist ached toward the end, a familiar burning sensation, but she pushed through with the stamina earned through decades of practice. For her final piece, she chose something unexpected. Not a classical masterwork, but a simple hymn that most people in the audience would recognize. Amazing Grace, arranged in a way that was both straightforward and deeply moving. She played it as an offering of gratitude, a thank you to this community that had given her something she thought she had lost forever. The simple joy of playing music without the weight of expectation. When the final note faded, there was a moment of perfect silence. Then the entire room rose to their feet, applause filling every corner of the community center. But Margaret noticed something that moved her even more than the standing ovation. People were hugging each other, wiping tears, holding hands. The music had done what music is supposed to do. It had reminded everyone in that room of their shared humanity. After the concert, during the reception Patricia had organized with donated cookies and coffee, Robert found Margaret surrounded by well-wishers. He waited patiently until he could speak with her privately. That was transformative, he said simply. Thank you. Thank you, Margaret replied. For asking a simple woman to play piano without knowing she had played before. For giving me the chance to start over. For teaching me that being a beginner is sometimes the most honest thing you can be. Robert smiled, finally understanding. I guess we're all students, aren't we? Always learning, always beginning again. Always, Margaret agreed. The next Tuesday, Margaret showed up for the beginner piano class wearing her floral dress and carrying her worn canvas bag. She sat in the back row in her usual seat, ready to practice scales and simple songs. Robert no longer saw her as someone to teach or someone to be in awe of. He saw her as what she had always been, a person on a journey, just like everyone else, trying to find meaning and connection through music. And in that small community center in a town most people had never heard of, something remarkable happened. A world-famous pianist and a young teacher fresh from conservatory both learned the same essential lesson, that mastery and humility are not opposites but partners, and that the most profound teaching happens when we're brave enough to remain forever students of the things that matter most.